Hello everyone. I wanted to continue our discussion on TCP today. We will discuss TCP Vegas, but before that I wanted to talk about some miscellaneous points. Based on our discussion in the live session a few days back, I looked up the answers to some questions that some students asked. So you can find out details about various protocols in RFCs, the request for comments. You can find these online. So usually these are written by experts in a particular field where they say what a protocol should and should not do. So sometimes the details of protocols are in RFCs, but of course there are also standardized bodies like IEEE and so IETF and so on, where they may actually have a standards group which defines what exactly the protocol rules are. Anyway, RFC 5681 and RFC 6298. So this one looks at congestion control, and this one looks at how to set the timer. So what I learned from RFC 5681 is that in slow start, so suppose we get an acknowledgement we receive an ACK. This is at the sender, which acknowledges n bytes of new data. So what does this mean? This means that of course the acknowledgement has a cumulative acknowledgement number. If that is n bytes further than let's say the previous ACK number which you got, so it's ACKing some new data which was not acknowledged earlier. And in that case, what we do is we increment the congestion window by the minimum of n and the maximum segment size. So earlier what I had said is that when you get an acknowledgement in the slow start, you just increase by MSS. But we have to do this. So suppose you get an ACK which doesn't acknowledge new data, then n is actually 0. So you wouldn't increase your congestion window at all. Okay? Whereas if you get an acknowledgement which is acknowledging new data, at most you will increase by 1 maximum segment size. So if n is greater than or equal to 1 MSS, you will increase by MSS. And why do we do this? Well, it may happen that the number of bytes that the acknowledgement is acknowledging may be quite small. Okay, so there are certain attacks possible, which was mentioned in the RFC. So suppose somebody has sent out a data packet, and let's say it was even 1 MSS. What the receiver might do is, let's say that the sequence number is, let's say 1, just to simplify it. What he could do is he could send many ACKs. Let's say he could acknowledge MSS 1 plus MSS by 10, let's say, right, and 1 plus 2 MSS by 10. And he could send let's say 10 of these. So then you have finally to 1 plus 10 times MSS by 10. So I send out 10 acknowledgements, each acknowledging a small part of this particular segment which was sent out. Okay, so there is nothing wrong with this. I am not breaking any rules. But what I am doing, if I do this, and if I follow the old rule which I mentioned, where for every acknowledgement which the sender receives, he increases by 1 MSS, then this is going to lead to an explosion in the congestion window size. It will actually become 11 over here because I've got back 10 acknowledgements. Okay. So to avoid that sort of an attack, they do this. So in this case, you would see that how many bytes are acknowledged. You're only acknowledging MSS by 10. So effectively, you will overall increase by only 1 MSS over here for all of these. Okay, so to prevent this sort of an attack, they recommend this. Okay, and it makes a lot of sense. Also in congestion avoidance, this is when congestion window is greater than or equal to SS threshold. And here, of course, slow start means the congestion window is less than the SS threshold. So here the RFC says that for every ACK which acknowledges new data, what we do is it recommends congestion window increments by MSS square by the congestion window. Okay, so of course we might think, we should do this differently. I mean, shouldn't we look at how many bytes are acknowledged and so on? So I couldn't find any recommendation for that. This is what they have given. But what they have stated also is that essentially in one round trip time, we should only increment the congestion window by 1. So whatever implementation we do should ensure that. That is what they recommend. But the formula that they give is this one. And this is going to increment by roughly 1 MSS if actually the segment sizes sent out are of size MSS. Okay. So they recommend, of course, that congestion windows only increase by 1 every round trip time. Okay. Also in the other RFC which I mentioned on the timeout, so that is for this is from RFC 6298. Here the initial RTO is set to 1 second or higher. Because you really don't know what the round trip time is, so you might as well set the timeout value high, because otherwise you will unnecessarily run into trouble. Then when you have a loss detected by timeout, so remember that there are two ways of detecting loss, either timeout or triple duplicate acknowledgement. So timeout is considered a very heavy loss, right? And we said you make congestion window equal to 1 MSS. But what you do is you make SS threshold equal to maximum of window by 2 or 2 times MSS. Okay, so it's possible. In an earlier lecture I said 1 times MSS, but the RFC recommends 2 MSS. Also, what is the window? So the window here is equal to maximum of congestion window and the advertised window. So the RFC would have called this window the flight size, essentially the amount of outstanding data you have in the network. So, of course, this is when you have loss from timeout, and also when we have a timeout loss, what do we do to the RTO? So suppose you just sent out one packet and it was lost and you got a timeout over here. This is the RTO. That RTO expires over here and you would retransmit the packet. So what should be the next RTO? Should you keep it the same thing? So let's look at the situation. So maybe there is a terrific amount of congestion in the network and you may be adding to the congestion. So it's possible that you should reduce the data rate at which you're sending packets into the network. So I'm sending out one packet every RTO over here, and that may be too high for the network. So what I should do is I should back off. It's sort of like a situation like you have at the MAC layer we saw with Wi-Fi and so on, and Ethernet, that every time you get a packet loss, you should sort of exponentially back off so that the network gets time to relax. So what they recommend is that RTO is set to this. Basically, you try to double the RTO. But of course there is a maximum value which would have been hard-coded in your machine, and you don't let the RTO get larger than that. Okay, but this, assuming this is very large, then this keeps doubling. Okay, you double this, you make it quite large, so that the next time you retransmit, okay, you wait for much longer, and the RTO after this, if you keep getting repeated timeouts, you will actually keep increasing this exponentially fast. So that your data rate into the network, assuming in this situation I'm sending out one packet, that is actually going to drop drastically so that the network relaxes. Right, so you'll find many small details about how to set the initial window size, and everything is specified in these RFCs if you're interested. So let's move on to our discussion on TCP Vegas. TCP Vegas makes use of round trip time to detect congestion in the network. So the earlier versions of TCP, before TCP Vegas came out, TCP Vegas came out around 1994, 95 or so. So the earlier versions, of course, came out in the 80s with Van Jacobson and so on. Right? And this TCP Vegas said, why don't we use RTT to detect congestion? And intuitively it might seem good. But you might say that is RTT a good way of detecting congestion or not? So the problem with this is that what if the RTT increases due to some other reason and it's not due to congestion? So we don't know when we are sending out from a source to the destination what exactly is happening in the rest of the network. Let's say this is the receiver. If we have a model which says that every router has, let's say, output queues and the queues are FIFO and so on, then of course we can make some connection, and we can say that if the round trip time delay increases, then maybe these queues are filling up. But what if this is not a good model of what is happening? Right? Maybe there is, let's say, some router which is where there are delays due to some other reason. Maybe there's a wireless link, and maybe there is some interference or something like that. A temporary interference, which is making maybe the delays a lot. Right? So you never know what exactly is causing a delay. So you are just observing the round trip time delays from you're sending out the packets here, and you're looking when you're getting back the corresponding acknowledgements. So you're not sure what exactly is taking place here. So that's one reason. Maybe the RTT is not so good always. There may be situations where it's not a good indication of congestion. Okay. And of course you may even argue about packet loss. There may be situations where packets are dropped not due to congestion. It may happen due to some other reason. Right? At some other lower layer, a packet might be lost. Okay, so you can say that what is a good indicator of congestion. And earlier people said, before this Vegas came out, they said we'll just focus on loss. So we use timeout and triple duplicate acknowledgement, and that's the only indication that we have of congestion. So why would we want to use round trip time? How does that help? Let's discuss that a little bit. Let's focus on one of these queues at one of the routers. So we said that whatever packets you get which are meant for this particular output link get dumped into this queue. So there may be TCP flows coming in here, but maybe you will have voice over IP over UDP. So you may have a voice application which is sending over the UDP transport protocol. And these are very latency sensitive. So you're talking to somebody, or it could be a video call or something like that. So a little bit of extra delay for the packets could affect the quality of service of that application. It might affect your Teams talk or whatever you're watching. So these applications are sensitive to the latency, whereas if you're just transferring a file with TCP, a little bit of delay here and there you don't care about, as long as the total time to transfer the file is reasonable. But what is done in the current internet is these are all dumped into the same queue. And what TCP Reno or TCP Tahoe or any of those protocols do is that they are designed to actually fill up the queue. Because if the queue is not full, of course we are assuming a simple model where all routers look like this with these queues, FIFO queues at the output links. Yes, but in that situation, what TCP Reno is going to do is it puts a few packets, there is no loss, so it increases the window size. It's either in slow start or it's in congestion avoidance, and it keeps increasing, and it only starts decreasing the window size when it gets a packet loss, either with a timeout or a triple duplicate acknowledgement. So TCP is designed to fill up the queues. And what happens in that case, these voice applications will be sending packets. They may not be sending too many packets, just enough to capture, let's say, the voice information, which may be few tens of kilobits per second. And what we end up with is that these voice packets also hit full queues. So the latency goes up and also the packets are dropped. Just because they are competing with these TCP flows. So this is a problem, even though TCP doesn't care so much about the latency, the queuing delays and the packet loss, these other applications might. So if we use a TCP protocol which is sensitive to these delays and it detects that these queues are filling up and it takes some remedial action whenever that happens, then that will help these voice over IP applications. So that was the idea of TCP Vegas, let's not wait till we get packet loss to back off. If there's a little bit of delay in the network, why don't we actually detect that and maybe reduce our congestion window or do something like that. Okay. So what TCP Vegas does is that it will of course have the same rules as TCP Reno. So first of all, it will detect congestion, or it will detect packet loss by timeout and triple duplicate acknowledgement. And it will modify the congestion window, and it will modify the SS threshold as in TCP Reno when these are detected. Okay, so it's basically TCP Reno with some additional features. Okay, so it will detect packet loss in these two ways, right? So the same rules as Reno are going to be used. But in addition to this, of course, there is slow start and so on. So let's just say that the slow start rules are the same. As Reno. So the congestion avoidance is a little bit different. So congestion avoidance, when the congestion window is greater than the SS threshold, TCP Reno is going to increase the congestion window by 1 maximum segment size every round trip time. And TCP Vegas is going to be a little bit conservative over there. Okay, so it's not going to do that blindly. Depending on what the round trip time is, it might do that, or it may not also do that. So what exactly does TCP Vegas do? Let's see. So suppose we model the path, the network path throughout all the routers as a single queue. So suppose we just say that this is the source and it's sending packets, and this is the receiver. And what's going to be the RTT? So the round trip time is going to have some minimum, which let's just call this the base RTT. Right? And the measured RTT is going to be a little bit above this. So the base RTT is just going to be based on the speed of flight delays and store and forward delay and so on, which we've discussed in earlier classes. So let's assume that is fixed. The minimum delay is fixed for a minimum round trip time, and these are the queuing delays. So suppose the queues were full, what would your data rate be? Or I beg your pardon, suppose the queue is empty, and this means no congestion. Then the expected data rate is the congestion window divided by the base RTT. So roughly you would expect you're sending out this many bytes per round trip time, and this is your actual round trip time. Okay, so if the queue is empty, then RTT is equal to the base RTT. So this is what you would expect your data rate to be. But in practice, of course, the queues may not be empty. Okay, and so the actual data rate which you get is what? It's congestion window divided by the round trip time that we normally see, and this is when the queues, it could be that the queues are non-empty, and this would be less than or equal to the expected rate, and this is because the RTT is always greater than or equal to the base RTT. So what the authors were saying is, let's compare these. What we do is we measure this. So we measure this. You'd have to actually look at the round trip times. You have to do this properly. So how are we going to do it? You'd actually have to keep a variable which is keeping track of what was the minimum RTT you saw in the past, in the recent past. Okay? And of course all of this is idealized. In practice what might happen is that the routing path might actually change, in which case the base RTT might jump up or jump down. Right? So all of those things add complications, and if at all somebody wants to do research on this sort of an idea, he'd have to give some intuition about what is the right thing to do. Do we look at the minimum RTT all the way from the beginning, or do we look at the minimum RTT only over, let's say, the past 5 seconds or something like that? Right? So all of those have to be done, but let's assume that the path is the same and the base RTT stays the same. So this is measured. So what we can do is we can look at the actual rate. Okay, so what we would have to do is we would look at congestion window divided by the round trip time, and we would actually not have to use the immediate instantaneous round trip time, because that would be very variable. It would not be constant, it would be change a lot, because the queuing delay too might change. So normally what you would do is, this of course is the minimum of the round trip time you've seen, but this you're going to smooth out the round trip times. Okay, so smooth out the measured RTTs in the recent past. So you can do something like, like we measured estim RTT in one of the earlier classes, right? When we were calculating, the timeout value and so on, we were estimating what the round trip time is. We were doing some smoothing. So we do that sort of a smoothing when we plug in the value over here. Okay. But anyway, that I'm just going to gloss over for the moment, and let's just assume that this is the actual RTT, actual rate. So the actual rate is going to be less than the expected rate, and if these two are close to each other, then we assume that essentially that there isn't much congestion. But the further apart they are, the more worried we get, and we say that there is congestion. So what Vegas says is that it calculates this quantity called diff, which is the difference between these two. expected rate minus the actual rate. And here is the rule in congestion avoidance. This is what we do. So congestion avoidance means that C window is greater than or equal to SS thresh. Here we are a little bit different from Reno. So we have a parameter, if diff is less than some alpha, what does this mean? This means that let's say there isn't much congestion. So what we do is that congestion window is increased by 1 MSS per round trip time. And one way to do that is using the method which we had discussed earlier. So this is one way to do it if you just want to have a self-clocking mechanism where at every act for new data. But of course you can do something more sophisticated, because if the segment sizes are not MSS, then we may get more, we might increase our congestion window more than MSS. Okay, so this is what we do, but essentially this is just like Reno. Okay, we are doing additive increase. Now there's another threshold, and if beta and if diff is greater than beta, then we say that the congestion is too much. And so what we do is we actually do additive decrease. So we decreased by 1 MSS per round trip time. So of course we could have a similar way maybe to implement it, but not instead of increasing, what we could do is we could decrease by this amount and so on. Okay. So this is different from Reno in the sense that Reno in congestion avoidance was only increasing the window size, but here we decrease it. So we say that my queuing delays are getting to be too high, which I'm indirectly measuring using this diff quantity. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to decrease the window size. So there is some congestion, so I slowly decrease the window size, and hopefully the queues are going to relax. Okay. So beta of course is going to be greater than alpha, but what if diff is between them? And you can guess what the answer is. So here we are saying the Q is somewhat, it's non-zero, but it's not too much. But it's good that it's non-zero, so that means if the Q is non-empty, that means I'm fully utilizing the bandwidth. There is some data always being sent out, but it's not too high. The queuing delay is not too high. So let's freeze the window size. Let's keep the window sizes fixed. Okay, and let's not make it increase or decrease. So the congestion window is not modified. Okay. Okay. So you're in congestion avoidance phase. the window size congestion window size is greater than the SS threshold, and you're calculating this diff, and every time an acknowledgement comes in, you can increase by this amount if diff is less than alpha. You could decrease by the same amount when diff is greater than beta, and you don't change the congestion window size if diff is between these two. So this is the main difference between TCP Vegas and Reno. Everything else is pretty much the same. So this is a very interesting idea, but then people will say, what should these parameters be like, and always researchers are very picky because there is already TCP Reno out there and so on. So they would say, will these choice of parameters affect the performance of existing TCP Reno connections? Because everything is going into the same queue. So how are these going to be compatible with each other if you have some of the flows using Vegas, some using Reno and so on? Or what if different people use different parameters for alpha and beta, then what's it going to be like? Right? So even though these ideas were very good, TCP Vegas didn't take off that much because of all these doubts that people had. Okay, so next what we will do is we will discuss some of the issues, and we'll see what happens when you have TCP Vegas flows, for example, competing with TCP Reno flows. Let us get some intuition of what we are doing over here. So what is this diff really? So diff, we said, is the difference between the expected rate and the actual rate. So what does that work out to be? Diff essentially is the congestion window divided by the base RTT minus the congestion window divided by the smooth RTT. And so by smooth RTT I mean you take the actual RTT measurements and you smooth it over some time interval, a short time interval before the present time. Okay, so this is the diff, and what does that end up giving us? So essentially we end up with RTT minus base RTT divided by base RTT times the round trip time. So what is this quantity in the numerator? So this quantity, so if we take the simple model where we have queues at every particular router along the path, okay, and so this is base RTT, essentially the speed of light delays and so on. This is the excess delay. This is the excess delay due to queuing plus the base RTT. So essentially the difference is the queuing delay. So diff is essentially measuring the queuing delay multiplied by some factor, and if the queuing delay is a lot, we say that we might as well decrease the congestion window a little bit. Okay, but if the queuing delay is small, we could either keep the congestion window fixed, or we might even want to increase it if the queuing delay is really small. So what does this mean? So suppose we take an example. So suppose we look at, we model the entire network as a single queue. And let's say packets are going in here, and let's say that this link has speed c bits per second. And suppose we are the only ones using this queue. There's a TCP Vegas flow going in here. Okay. So what is diff equal to? It's the congestion window And what is the queuing delay? Suppose that this is filled up to size B bytes or B bits, right? So the queuing delay is going to be what? B divided by C. Divided by RTT times the base RTT. Right, and what does this come out to be? So congestion window divided by let's say the round trip time, so this is your actual data rate. So what would be your actual data rate? It's essentially how much data you're pushing through from one end to the other, and you're pushing through at C bits per second, right? So this is approximately equal to C bits per second, and so I'm going to cancel out C with these two. So this is roughly equal to B divided by the base RTT. Right, so if I'm the only person using the network, then diff is really equal to this quantity. Okay, and so what does this really translate into practice? Well, so suppose alpha is given by 30 kilobit per second. 30 so I believe what they have given is in the paper 30 kilobytes per second, and remember that alpha and beta have to be in this units of essentially the same as the throughput units, and beta has to be higher than this, and beta, let's say, is 60 kbps. And suppose your base RTT is 100 millisecond. Okay. So what does this mean? Suppose these are the parameters when this is a TCP Vegas flow. This is a reasonably large round trip time. You can go across the country with this sort of a round trip time. So suppose these were the parameters that I was using. How much buffer would I use up in the queue? Okay, and so roughly what we are going to do is essentially we are going to ensure that diff ends up between beta and alpha. Right? If alpha is if diff is less than alpha, we increase the window size, right? And if diff is greater than beta, then we decrease the window size. So essentially this is what we are targeting. We are targeting diff to be between these two, right? And so effectively B divided by base RTT is going to be between alpha and beta. So we are assuming a very simplified model where there is only a single TCP Vegas flow in the net. Okay. So what does this end up giving us? B is between beta times the base RTT. Okay. And effectively this is going to be equal to 60 or 6 kilobyte, and here we are going to get alpha times the base RTT, and this is what, 3 kilobyte. So essentially, these are the default parameters which we use, which the authors propose in their paper. We will end up using all the bandwidth, okay, and but at the same time, our queuing delay, the queue size is going to be roughly equal to something like 6 kilobytes, so between 3 and 6 kilobytes. Okay, so it will be hovering within that range. Okay. So this is really nice because unlike TCP Reno, which is going to overflow the queue, I mean, no matter what you do, TCP Reno is designed to overflow the queue somewhere at some intermediate router. But TCP Vegas will, if it works according to plan, it will ensure that this queue doesn't get full and it's between these two ranges. But this is a very simplified situation we've looked at. In practice, the base RTT could be higher or lower. If it was 10 times higher, then the queue would be 10 times larger, okay, in terms of bytes. And if we set these alpha and beta to be larger or smaller, then again the queue size would be different. Okay, but so these would have to be set appropriately, and that was one of the drawbacks of the paper, the TCP Vegas paper, that people would say, what should I set alpha and beta to in practice? Because maybe it works in some situations, maybe the queues will get too large, and some situations maybe they will get too small. Okay. Anyway, so this was the idea of TCP Vegas, and now I want to consider 2 points. What if you have what if TCP Vegas flows compete with TCP Reno flows? This is one question. And second, what if you have many competing TCP, what if you have only TCP Vegas flows? How is that different from, say, having a situation where you have all Reno flows? What if we, let's say, replace all Reno flows in the internet with Vegas? So this is a hypothetical question. Of course, what people use practically is essentially what the OS gives them, right? So the operating system would have initially essentially implemented Reno. So we can't just tell everybody overnight to update their OS or something so that it uses Vegas. But this is a practical situation that somebody may want to use Vegas, but everybody else is using Reno. So what happens to this TCP flow? So let's look at the first point. Let's look at Reno versus Vegas when they are competing with each other. So let's look at this sort of a topology. There is a source. Let's say this is a bottleneck link. Let's say this is the first receiver. And S2 is sending data to R2. So this is Reno and this is Vegas. So let's assume this is the bottleneck, meaning that the bandwidth on these links is way higher than this. So if at all there is any congestion, it happens at this particular router at the output queue. So let's focus on this queue. So let me draw the queue size over time. So we will ignore slow start here in the analysis. So suppose there is only congestion avoidance. We are simplifying things a lot. The real situation would be very tricky because there are multiple phases in TCP. So we ignore the slow start and we only assume that we are in congestion avoidance. So let's say that both of them have some window size, right? Let's say that the queue size has become 0. Okay, so this is the queue size. And let's say that this is the maximum queue size that we can have. Okay, this is so initially let's say that both of them have congestion window quite low, so the queue is pretty much empty. Okay, so both of them have essentially, let's assume that both of them are essentially sending packets into the same queue and their packets roughly face the same queuing relay. So that's what we're going to assume. So let's say that this threshold corresponds to beta and this one corresponds to alpha. Okay, so of course this is given in queue size, but we are just saying that when the queue size exceeds this, let's say that diff is greater than alpha. Let's maybe call it Q1 and Q2. So we're going to assume that if Q1 is equal to alpha, when when the queue size is equal to Q, then diff is equal to alpha for the Vegas flow. And if Q is equal to Q2, then diff is equal to beta, okay, for this particular Vegas flow. Okay, so let's assume that's the way it is set up, the alpha and beta are chosen such that that happens. So initially the queue size is low, so both of them are in additive increase phase. So let's say that this is the queue size, so both Reno and Vegas are in the additive increase phase. Okay. Now the queue size exceeds this, so what does Vegas do? So diff is now between alpha and beta. So here Vegas freezes the congestion window, but Reno is in the AI mode, right? Reno keeps increasing the window size. So Reno is still in the additive increase phase. Okay. Now let's say that, so what is going to happen, we'd have to think. Right, so Vegas is going to freeze its window size, but Reno keeps increasing its window size, so the queue still increases in size because the input rate is increasing overall. Okay. Now what happens? Now when the queue size exceeds this particular threshold, Vegas goes into the additive decrease, you can say. So it decreases its own congestion window, whereas Reno is going to continue increasing its window size. Reno only knows one thing, additive increase, and only if a packet is lost and it detects it due to timeout or some other reason, 3 duplicate acknowledgements, only then is it going to decrease the window size. So Vegas decreases, but Reno is still in AI, the additive increase phase. Okay, so what may happen is that Vegas keeps decreasing and Reno keeps increasing, but still so effectively maybe the net input rate actually stays constant. Okay, assuming that this decrease in the window size of Vegas is compensated for by the increase in window size of the Reno flow. Okay, of course the actual situation will depend on the exact RTTs between the two of them and whatnot. But let's say that the input rate stays the same effectively, and we know that the input rate was greater than this output emptying rate because that's why the Q was increasing. So this will keep increasing until we hit the maximum rate, and this is where we have packet loss. And in this situation, both Reno and Vegas decrease their window sizes. So essentially they do a multiplicative decrease. So let's see what happens over here. So suppose we look at window sizes. This is with time. And let's just say this is the point where the Q hits Q1, this is where it hits Q2. Okay. So this is the congestion window of Reno. And what about Vegas? Vegas is going to increase the congestion window. Let's say that they start out at roughly the same value. It's going to keep the window size constant. And here it's actually going to decrease the window size until we get packet loss here. So we decrease the window size. So what's going to happen now? Now you have the loss. So Reno is going to decrease its window size to half. Okay. And Vegas is also going to do the same. The window decrease rule is the same. So it decreases. Right, so both of them are going to decrease their window size to half. Right, and then they will go into what's going to happen. Of course, it depends on the Q size that they actually measure, right? So we'll have to see if it very quickly decreases. Okay, so depending on where the Q size, what the Q size is, Vegas is either going to be in the additive increase or the freezing mode, or when it actually decreases the window size. But what do we observe from this? We see that Reno is very aggressive compared to Vegas. So if you have TCP Vegas flows competing with TCP Reno, then you're going to be in trouble. The Reno flows are just going to eat up all the bandwidth and they're going to push Vegas down. So Reno is aggressive compared to Vegas. So this is also another reason why you may not want to use Vegas, because if everybody else is still using Reno, then they are going to kill you. And you haven't achieved empty queues. So the idea was that if you use Vegas, the queue will never reach maximum capacity. It won't reach this level. So you'll have very few packet losses, and if there is voice over IP competing, let's say using UDP, those flows also do not face much delay. Right? But what we end up here is anyway the queue gets full because Reno is designed to do that. So let's answer the second question. What if we have only Vegas flows? So let's say that this is the queue size again over time. Let's say this is the max. And let's say that this is Q2 and this is Q1. So what do we have here? So we have, let's say, a similar topology, but we have lots of let's say Vegas flows. Okay, so SI to RI is an, let's say, is a Vegas flow. Okay, so this term flow, I've been using it, maybe I didn't define it very clearly, but essentially all packets corresponding to a particular TCP connection are called a flow. If you read a research paper on TCP, that's what they mean. So a TCP flow is defined by what? It's defined by 5 numbers, what are called 5 tuples. So the source and destination, IP and port numbers, that gives us 4 numbers. So each of them has, an IP address and a port number, and you have the protocol field. This is in the IP header, and of course this is going to say that the protocol is TCP. Okay, so all packets corresponding to this particular source and destination IP and port number, they are all grouped together and they are called a flow. So in this situation, what is going to happen? Let's say that the queue is small, and let's say that everybody has the same round trip time. Yes. So this is a simplifying assumption. It becomes more complicated when they have different round trip times. So now the queue is less than alpha, so everybody is in the additive increase mode. But now it goes here beyond Q1. So here the queue is going to hover around, right? And suppose due to some sort of a noise in the system, in the statistical system, whatever, suppose it goes above this, the different flows are going to go into the decrease mode, where they decrease the congestion window a little bit, because of which the queue size will decrease, right? And it might hover down here, it might go beyond Q1, in which case they will increase, right? But most of the time we would expect the queue size to be between Q1 and Q2, and that is good because there is no packet loss. And that is fantastic. Okay, there is no need to retransmit and so on. Okay, and also if there is a competing voice over IP flow, let's say the voice over IP is not using much bandwidth, so we don't have to worry too much about that flow causing congestion. But that flow is also not going to face too much queuing delays, because it will face queuing delays roughly corresponding to these two queue sizes, right? And queuing delays are between Q1 by C and Q2 by C, where C is the output rate of the queue. So this is good for any, let's say, voice over IP type application. Also, there is something else advantages to this situation. So notice that the queue is non-zero all the time here. So what does that mean? It means that the queue is always transmitting something or the other. So the overall throughput of the system is actually C bits per second. So this is C bits per second. So the total throughput of all the flows put together is actually C bits per second. In this situation, because there are lots of packet losses, the queue might actually reach 0, and if the queue is completely empty, the throughput can actually fall below C. So the input rate might be less than C bits per second. So you may have situations where the queue is unutilized, the queue size has become 0 and the input rate is less than the output rate. Okay, so the overall throughput might actually drop below C. Okay. So this is another advantage which the authors of the TCP Vegas paper highlight, that the throughput can be higher than for the all Reno case. So here I mean where all the flows are Reno. Okay. Because here the queues never empty. Unlike the all Reno case. So the paper claims that they actually got 50% improved throughput over Reno. So the all Vegas case gave 50% higher throughput than the all Reno case. Okay, so this is when we are talking about the total throughput. Right, so this is all that I wanted to mention about TCP. We've covered quite a few aspects of TCP, but TCP has been a heavy research area for this paper on Vegas came out 25 years back, and lots of work has been done even since then. Nowadays, the latest protocols are things like TCP Cubic, which is much more aggressive than TCP Reno, in fact. So, of course, you have to be careful in building something more aggressive than Reno, because then you're competing with Reno flows which other people have, and you might push them down. So, all these newer protocols which were built, after even TCP Vegas, they all had to show that in certain situations where you had very little bandwidth in the network, maybe the data rates were of the order of megabits per second, you were behaving almost like Reno, right? But suppose there were gigabits per second available, in those situations it may happen that Reno doesn't perform so well. Okay, even if you get a packet loss due to a non-congestion reason, Reno is going to back off a lot and it will maybe not be able to use gigabits per second of throughput available. So things like TCP Cubic will be able to grab all that bandwidth, and at the same time, if the bandwidth available is not too high in the network, they will behave more or less like Reno. Right? So there are some constraints to be used while developing newer TCP protocols. So a lot of research has taken place, and maybe in an advanced networking course you might study some of those. So the remaining few lectures I wanted to focus on the application layer. There are interesting things over there. So of course we have to talk about basic things like how does DNS work and so on. But also there are interesting things done at the application layer, which things like peer-to-peer networks. So peer-to-peer network was built for file sharing and so on. It's still very popular. So we look at peer-to-peer networks and DNS, and if time permits, we look at things like email, which are basic applications which have stuck for 30 years, and they are still going strong, right? But the application layer, of course, is you can do anything at the application layer. You are free to build any application. So there's really no end to the application layer. So I mean. That would be a long story on its own. So we will just touch a few topics at the application layer.